Tabitha woke early to her father gently shaking her and calling her name. It was still dark, but he roused her and her brothers early before the sun rose to work. She rolled onto the edge of the bed in the darkness. As her vision cleared, she stood and walked to the corner of her room. There sat a broken mirror, a basin of water, and a clean towel. Her father rose early every morning to draw water for the family from the well just outside the farmhouse. She washed her face with the still cool water, smelling the familiar fragrance of minerals before drying her face with the towel. Soon she was on the porch soaking in the humid morning air, watching the sun rise between the towers on the horizon. Her father had also made breakfast, nothing special, just some old bread and butter to start the day. She nibbled on the bread as she scanned the settlement. About 20 families lived and worked on the land here, raising animals and growing wheat for everyone to share. Before the fall, her great-grandfather owned the farm, but as families would come starving, he would share what he had as such that they had. Now the farm belonged to everyone, as, by this time, through careful matching and arranged marriages, pretty much every family group had a familial claim to the land. Each family had a voice in the council that met monthly to discuss matters of the farm and the needs of the community, and to arrange pairings, when necessary, for the next generation. The system had led to the community slowly growing larger with each passing generation, but this in itself led to a new problem. The reality of the settlement was that the land grew poorer and poorer each year, making resources more and more scarce with every passing season. This led to some tension in the community as everyone worked to the breaking point to keep up with the demand. Every family needed resources to grow food for everyone, but the resources were getting more and more difficult to come by. They had explored beyond the farm looking for a solution, but most of the land was dry and barren and other parts were simply impassable. They were an island of plenty, but for some reason that plenty was slowly fading. She sat in her mother's rocking chair on the porch, surveying the wheat before her. Even in the years of her own life, she could see the wheat was not what it once was. It did not seem to matter what her father tried. Year after year, there was just less harvest. They barely had enough last year to fill the storehouses for winter. Tabitha nibbled on the stale bread as her father, Theodore, came over from the house to stand at her side. Her father talked very little these days. Between her mother's death and the farm steadily growing less productive, he felt the weight of the world pressing on him. When the settlement sent out people to explore the surrounding landscape, the lot had fallen on her mother and several others to go forth and explore. Only her mother returned, but she died soon after. They had pushed out further and further, looking for anything that could help them make a difference in the community, but they came upon a large crater close to the towers on the horizon, miles from the farm, and they'd all become terribly ill. They tried to return to the settlement, but in the end, she was the only one who made it back. Tabitha looked out at the horizon to the specific spot where she first saw her mother returning, a thin frame and a shadow of the woman she remembered. She had collapsed into her father's arms as they rushed to meet her. Sitting on the porch all those years later, she looked out with her father once again. She thought that maybe her mind was playing tricks on her, but they were not. There, on the horizon, coming in from the same direction as her mother, was another tall figure. In the large barn, they had gathered to listen to the stranger. Tabitha sat in the loft of the barn with the other children, trying to eavesdrop on the adults' conversation. Her father stood with the man before the crowd. He was dressed in a long, threadbare coat and had a long, graying beard. He said that he came from the other side of the towers. No one since the fall had come into the settlement from beyond the towers. Indeed, no one had come in, period, in the last several years. It was unimaginable that someone could cross the vast wilderness, much less travel beyond the range of the towers. Her father stood quietly behind the man as he addressed the heads of the other families. She and her father ran out to meet the stranger, who emerged from the field carrying a large pack and a walking stick. He also wore a large heart-shaped locket around his neck. Tabitha felt drawn to the shiny, polished object. It was incredibly beautiful and ornate, hanging by a small silver chain low under his beard. It still shone in front of the crowd, and he jovially explained himself to the others. "I have come to this land looking for someone, hoping to find them well and give them something." The group murmured slightly to each other, looking around the room. "My name is Simon," he continued, "and the person I am looking for is named Tristen." He took the locket, holding it in front of himself. "I was tasked by another, a promise made to a dying friend, to deliver this locket to Tristen." Her father stepped forward. "There is no one by that name among us, and as I explained to you before, no one has come here for many generations." The man Simon looked out at the crowd, scanning the group as each family head turned to nod in agreement with her father. She was surprised as Simon smiled. "My journey continues then," he exclaimed. "But before it does, I must replenish my supplies." She could feel the tension in the group increase. They had very little to share with strangers. Sensing their hesitation, he set the large pack on the ground and opened it. "I have something to offer in return, of course," he said, and produced a sack from the bag and placed it on the ground in front of the group. He untied the sack and pulled from it a handful of some sort of seed. Sitting at the dinner table that night, Simon, her father, and the boys, she listened as their guest explained nitrogen deficiency in the soil was the reason the wheat crop was growing less and less by the year. Nitrogen plays an important part of the process of growing plants, and by growing the same plant year after year, the soil had begun to fail. Her father countered that they used the animal dung to fertilize the soil, but Simon shook his head. "It's not enough, and at best you have delayed the problem." The sack of soybeans lay in the corner, and Tabitha's father pointed to them. "But this will cure the soil?" he asked, in an unconvinced tone. Simon nodded. "After the fall, I'm guessing that your family had access to very few seeds, probably only what was available when the fall occurred. The soil was rich at first," Simon continued to explain, "but over time it has slowly grown depleted." This time, Simon pointed out the sack. "Long before the fall, our people used a method known as crop rotation to protect the soil before artificial methods were developed. Soybeans were one of the crops they used." "Can you eat it, though?" her eldest brother Jesse asked. Simon smiled. "It's not as tasty as wheat," he replied, "but it is very nutritious." "How do you know all this?" Tabitha asked, unable to contain her curiosity. "I read it," Simon responded, pointing in the direction of the towers. "In the old city, they have a building full of books, filled with stories and information from before the fall. I spent some time there, learning what I could before I continued on my journey." "To find Tristen?" Tabitha asked. Simon gripped the locket tightly. "Yes," he responded. Tabitha's father shot her a look that said she was not allowed to ask any more questions that night. Later in the evening, she stared again at the towers in the fading light. Since she had been little, she had dreamed of what could be out there. To her and her father, it might as well be on the other side of the world. But Simon had been there, even further. She hoped that in the coming days she would get to ask him more about his travels. This would be difficult. Simon was in high demand among the people in the settlement over the next few days. His knowledge improved almost every aspect of the group's quality of living, and others in the community invited him over constantly to help them solve their problems, whatever they may be. But of course, all of them had their own duties in the settlements as well, and work did not go away just because Simon was there. But it did get noticeably easier as time went on, and the morale of the group seemed to be improving, with only one exception. Tabitha's father grew more and more impatient with Simon as his popularity grew. Everything he was doing was working, and the people prospered, but for some reason it was not enough for her father. This also made seeing Simon difficult, as her father had yet to invite him again to their home and only tolerated him in the field at the insistence of the other elders. The soybeans grew well, and as Simon's 1 year with them turned into 2, it was true the wheat grew better where the soybeans had been planted before. The new food also added some variety to their diets, and Simon taught them lots of new ways to prepare both crops, as well as the animals they tended. Still, despite her father's distaste for him, she occasionally did get some time to ask more questions about his travels and adventures, which seemed to delight him, as he remarked few in the settlement asked him about such things. At first he told her stories of his own adventures, coming south through the towers made of stone built before the fall, all empty and stripped bare. They stood as imposing monuments to the world that was slowly crumbling to dust. He told her about the books he had read. Some were based on history, some on fantasy, some a mixture of both. She loved these stories the most, tales of eccentric figures and glorious battles of old. Stories of wondrous world filled with miraculous discoveries. Her father did not approve of all these stories and often would criticize her for following Simon around with her head in the clouds. "You need to be in the here and the now," he would say. But the here and the now was so laborious to her. She longed to escape and see more of the world, and Simon was the closest she may ever come to realizing that dream. But her father insisted that all the old tales of the world before the fall were untrue or of little use. "How could they be true?" he would say. "If they had everything that you say, how come things are the way they are now?" She asked Simon what he believed had happened. He mused that the sheer volume of stories was proof that the old world was full of comforts. "They had time to create that we do not," he explained. This made her sad, but Simon tried to cheer her up by saying that if their world had been perfect, then it would have never fallen. Tabitha pondered this, thinking, ironically, that Simon and her father at least agreed on that one point. After spending some time living in the settlement, Simon built a small home, and she would go visit when she could, sitting on the porch till he came home from whatever work he had been given himself for the day. He worked as hard, if not harder, than any other person in the settlement, save maybe Tabitha's own father, but always seemed to make time for her. He admired her thirst for knowledge, he said to her once, as he was teaching her how to read. Almost no one in the settlement could read, and they had few books to read anyway, but in Simon's bag were many books. As the months went on, she read them as she gained in ability. She read history, philosophy, holy books, and the works of fiction, absorbing all that she could. Once as they sat on the porch in the evening, she finally asked him the question that she had wanted to ask since he arrived. "Who is Tristen?" He repeated the question, stroking his even longer, grayer beard. He smiled. "Can you keep a secret?" he asked her, and she nodded. He leaned in close and whispered, "I don't know." She leaned back, puzzled, and he laughed, amused, leaning back in his own chair. "I grew up in a settlement not too unlike this one," he continued. She found herself trying to imagine the other farm as he described it. "It is smaller, but just as organized and constantly busy as this one," he said. "One day a woman came into the town holding this locket. She was dying, so I took her home and tried to nurse her back to health." She could see his cheeks turn red as his eyes welled with tears. "She never fully recovered, but we spent the next few years happily caring for each other." Simon looked at her as he held up the locket. "When she died, she asked me to keep searching for Tristen, to give the locket to them." He glanced at the towers far away from the porch where they both sat. "I buried her, and the next day I honored her wish." He looked back at Tabitha. "She taught me so much, as she had wandered for a long time looking for Tristen before she met me." He laughed. "I'm not even sure she knew who Tristen was either, as all she gave me was the locket and a name." "You have nothing else to go on?" Tabitha asked, astounded by the story. The older man shook his head. "I don't even know if it's a boy or a girl," he said, opening the locket and looking inside. Tabitha got up to see, but Simon closed it again. She looked puzzled, but the man smiled. "What is inside is for my love, myself, and Tristen to know, or whoever takes over when I'm done searching," he mused. Tabitha went home more confused that day than ever. Simon had traveled hundreds of miles over inhospitable land, facing starvation and worse, to find what, to her mind, was an impossible task. Was Tristen even still alive? Did this person ever exist at all? She looked at the towers on her way home in the distance. She had all her life wanted to know what was there, but never had she imagined it worth the risk to see them. She thought of her mother and went to her grave behind their home. To her surprise, she found her father there. She went and stood beside him as the rain that had threatened all day slowly picked up. Her father, without turning, asked if she had seen Simon again. She hesitated, but answered truthfully. Her father sighed, and she noticed he seemed older than a few days ago. "You remind me of her," he said, pointing at the grave. When the town began to worry about the future, she was not chosen to search the surrounding lands. She volunteered to go. Tabitha processed this. "The thing that concerns me," he said as the rain fell harder, "is that he reminds me of her as well." Her father turns towards her. When he leaves, would you go with him? Her father asked, and in his eyes she could see fear like she had never seen before. As the rain drenched them, she stood resolute and shook her head no. Her father embraced her, and then they went inside to escape the rain. Years turned to more years, then even more. Simon continued to stay, which made the people of the settlement very happy. But Tabitha could tell he was growing more anxious. He would often look south away from the towers, and she had no doubt that he planned to cross the mountains there. The settlement had changed much, and Simon had gotten some of the old machines from before the fall working, and others were learning to read and use the books. After several years, Simon announced he would head south in the spring. The people begged him to stay, even Tabitha's father, who was growing more and more fond of the man along with everyone else. I promised myself I would remain until there was plenty to leave behind, and I was not a burden to the sources of food, he replied to the group. It was true that things had improved a great deal in the last several years. There was enough that if Simon took some from his journey, none would go hungry. Everyone nervously counted the days till spring, but before Simon's day came, more visitors came to call from the north. It was early in the morning once again. 3 men with several dogs. She had seen them in the distance, but this time Simon had intercepted her and her father, insisting Tabitha return home. Simon had a grave look on his face, and she feared what it all meant. That night they called another meeting, and now 18, Tabitha sat with the adults as Simon and her father broke the news. I know of these men, Simon exclaimed. They also come from north of the towers, where they have taken from the settlements there for years. Why are they here? Voices asked, and Tabitha's father explained. They say they wish to trade a portion of our labor in exchange for our safety. The crowd murmured. What did that mean? They will take and take until you have nothing left, and kill anyone who disagrees with them, Simon explained. I have seen it before. And the room's murmurs grew louder. How will we defend ourselves? A voice asked, and everyone went quiet. It's too soon to make the correct decision tonight, he said. They have given us 2 days. But before he could finish his thought, Tabitha saw him raise a hand to her father. Her father had stepped forward to speak, but was stopped by Simon's signal. Go home, and tomorrow we will be able to see a solution more clearly. Everyone nodded and returned home, but Tabitha's father told her to go home with her brothers. She did, but as soon as they were asleep, she crept from the house back to town, to Simon's house. It was now raining again, even harder than when she promised her father she would not leave the village to follow Simon. That moment was first and foremost on her mind as she crept slowly towards the porch. She heard her father's voice. You do not have to go alone, he said, and Tabitha crept underneath the window. You heard them, Simon responded. They followed me here. I am responsible, and I will not see you all suffer for it. You could not have known they followed you, and it's been years, Tabitha's father argued, and how could they have followed you? There was a long pause, and then the door opened in the cabin. Tabitha ducked under the porch. I'll return by morning, Simon said, walking into the darkness. And if you don't? Her father asked with desperation in his voice. Then it will be up to you to prepare everyone else for the worst. She watched under the porch as Simon extended his hand to her father. Theodore, I know that you and I have not always seen eye to eye, but thank you for welcoming me to your home all those years ago. Her father took the outstretched hand. You have to come back and tell Tabitha goodbye, he said, and Simon nodded. He turned to go, but Tabitha crawled out from under the porch, calling for him. But in the wet grime she slipped and fell, hitting her head on the porch step. In the howling rain she saw her father rush to her side. Then she felt heavy and went to sleep. Tabitha woke in bed and reached for the back of her head, feeling a swollen knot. She rolled to her side as a wave of nausea swelled in her. She fought not to be sick. She stood slowly and walked to the porch. The elders of the community were there, and her father addressed them. Why did he go alone? And Tabitha's father shook his head. He noticed Tabitha and helped her to her mother's chair. He then explained to the group that the bandits had in fact only given them till noon the next day to decide, or they would turn the dogs loose on the town. Simon went to stop them at night, but told us to be ready in case he failed, her father said. They organized the townspeople with farming tools and placed the young and the old in the central barn. Then they waited. Simon returned 2 days later. All the men had gathered on the first day of the week, a practice Simon started, to socialize over tea. He was sitting on his porch where they all met, cup in hand, a fresh pot behind him. His legs had been mauled by dogs and were now crippled. How he had dragged himself to his home, no one could have imagined. But in spite of the pain and growing infection, he was in good spirits. The men from the north were never seen again, but Simon's health grew steadily worse from his wounds. It quickly became apparent that Simon was not going to live much longer. As his fever increased, he asked Theodore if he could see Tabitha. Tabitha walked into Simon's room. She took his hand, and his eyes opened slowly. She noticed her father had not come in with her. She turned and looked, and he nodded to her from the door and closed it. "Elise?" Simon asked, and Tabitha realized he was calling for his lost love. "No, it's me," Tabitha said, and Simon smiled. "I am sorry," he said, gripping her hand. "I am sad that I have no one else to leave this to, and I am sorry to leave you all now." She realized that he had something in his hand, and as he gripped hers, he dropped the item into her palm. It was the locket. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You must go on," she pleaded. "You have not found Tristen." "My dear child," he said as his breath grew more labored, "more important than finding Tristen was the journey." He brushed her cheek. "And the people I have met and helped along the way." She put the locket around her neck and gripped his hand again. "Until you find Tristen," he said, "don't stop learning." He took a hoarse breath. "Don't stop helping," he continued, "and never give up." His grip slowly faded, and his eyes went blank. Tabitha stood slowly, and after a moment looked at the locket. She took a deep breath and opened it. Inside was not a picture, just an inscription. "Not all who wander are lost." Tabitha stood with her bag facing the mountains south, beside her mother and Simon's grave. Her father had buried him in the family plot behind the house. It would not have been difficult to convince any family of the settlement to bury him in their own plots. In just a few short years, he had worked his way into every family's heart. Tabitha set a note on her mother's grave for her father, then shouldered her pack and headed south. She did not know what lay ahead. It did not matter. She would find Tristen and help anyone who needed her on the way. "Not all who wander are lost," she read on Simon's tombstone one more time. She turned to face the wilderness and was surprised to see her father waiting for her. She walked to him, slowly steeling herself for what may come. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at her the same sorrowful expression he had when her mother had passed. As she got closer, he stepped forward and embraced her again, kissing her on top of the head. He handed her a bag of wheat and put it in her pack. "For the next settlement," he said, and embraced her once more. He stood between the two headstones for a while, but she saw him turn and go home just before she lost sight of him. Again she faced south, towards the mountain, as the sun slowly climbed in the sky. She opened the locket once more around her neck. This was going to be quite an adventure.